The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. At 23 years old, he had been part of the Queen's Guard for only 8 months, but he had already mastered the art of standing perfectly still for hours. His black bearskin hat sat heavy on his head, and his rifle rested against his shoulder with practiced precision. James had always dreamed of this moment. Growing up in a small village in Yorkshire, he would watch the changing of the guard on television with his grandmother, who would tell him stories about his great-grandfather, who had served in the same regiment during World War II. Now, as he stood at his post outside the palace gates, he felt the weight of that legacy on his shoulders. The tourists began gathering early that Tuesday morning in September. Cameras clicked constantly as visitors from around the world posed for photos in front of the iconic red-uniformed guards. James had learned to ignore the flashes, the pointing fingers, and the occasional attempts by visitors to make him smile or break his composure. His training had been clear: remain motionless, eyes forward, expression neutral, no matter what happened around him. A group of school children arrived with their teacher, their excited chatter filling the air. They pressed against the metal barriers, wide-eyed with wonder at seeing real palace guards up close. One little girl with pigtails kept waving at James, her face beaming with innocent joy. He wanted to wave back, but kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, just as he had been taught. The morning passed slowly, as mornings always did during guard duty. James's feet began to ache in his polished black boots, and sweat trickled down his back under the thick wool uniform. The September sun was warmer than usual, making the heavy ceremonial clothing even more uncomfortable, but he remained perfectly still, a living statue representing centuries of British military tradition. Around midday, something unusual began to happen. Word spread through the crowd that someone special was coming. James noticed the palace staff moving with more urgency, and additional security personnel appeared at various points around the grounds. The tourists sensed the change in atmosphere and began pushing closer to the barriers, their cameras ready. Then James saw her walking slowly across the courtyard. It was an elderly woman, probably in her 80s, being helped by a younger man, who appeared to be her son. She moved with difficulty, using a walking stick, but there was something determined about her approach. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small bouquet of flowers. The woman stopped directly in front of James's post. The crowd fell silent, sensing that something important was about to happen. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes, and James felt his heart begin to race, though his expression remained unchanged. The woman reached into her handbag and pulled out an old, faded photograph. She held it up for James to see, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a black-and-white picture of a young soldier in a uniform very similar to his own. The man in the photo had the same proud bearing, the same serious expression that James maintained during his duties. The woman's voice was soft but clear as she spoke. "This is my father," she said, her words carrying across the silent courtyard. "He stood where you stand now, 70 years ago. He was part of the guard that protected King George VI." Her voice trembled with emotion as she continued. "He passed away last month, and I promised him I would come here to honor his memory." James felt something shift inside his chest. All his training, all the hours of practice maintaining his composure, suddenly seemed less important than this moment. Here was a connection to the past, a living link to the history he was now part of. This woman's father had stood in the same spot, felt the same pride, carried the same responsibility. The elderly woman placed the flowers at the base of the gate just a few feet from where James stood. "He would have been so proud to see you carrying on the tradition," she whispered, looking directly into James's eyes. "Thank you for your service." The crowd remained respectfully quiet, many of them realizing they were witnessing something special. James felt his eyes beginning to water, and for the first time since beginning his duties as a royal guard, he struggled to maintain his stoic expression. Every instinct told him to remain motionless, but every fiber of his being wanted to acknowledge this woman's tribute to her father. The moment stretched on, filled with unspoken understanding between the young guard and the grieving daughter. James could feel the weight of history, the connection between past and present, the continuous line of service that linked him to generations of soldiers who had stood in this same place, protecting the same institution, upholding the same values. As the woman prepared to leave, supported by her son, she looked back one more time at James. In that look, he saw gratitude, pride, and a deep understanding of what his service meant. She nodded slightly, a gesture of respect from one military family to another. The crowd began to disperse, but the impact of the encounter remained, settling deep in James's heart. Standing there in the afternoon sun, James realized that his duty was about more than just ceremony and tradition. He was part of something larger, something that connected him to heroes of the past and guardians of the future. The woman's father had stood where he stood, had felt what he felt, had served with the same dedication and pride. For the rest of his shift, James stood taller, his uniform feeling less heavy, his purpose clearer than ever before. The winter winds of December cut through Edinburgh like icy knives, but Guardsman Sarah Thompson stood firm at her post outside the palace of Holyrood House. Snow had been falling steadily since dawn, covering the ancient cobblestones with a pristine, white blanket that sparkled under the pale Scottish sun. At 25, Sarah was one of the few women in the Queen's Guard, and she took immense pride in breaking barriers while maintaining the highest standards of the regiment. Sarah had joined the military straight from university, where she had studied history. Her fascination with royal traditions and military heritage had drawn her to this prestigious posting. Standing guard at the official residence of the British monarchy in Scotland was both an honor and a challenge, especially during the harsh winter months when tourists were few, but the duty remained constant. The morning had been quiet, with only a handful of hardy visitors braving the cold to see the palace guards. Sarah's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, but her posture remained perfect, her ceremonial rifle held with unwavering precision. Her red tunic provided little warmth against the biting wind, but she had learned to ignore physical discomfort during her extensive training. Around noon, a small group approached the palace gates. Unlike the usual tourists with their cameras and guidebooks, these visitors moved with a solemnity that immediately caught Sarah's attention. There were about 12 people, ranging in age from children to elderly adults, all dressed warmly against the cold. They carried wreaths and small bouquets of flowers, and their faces showed a mixture of sadness and determination. An older gentleman stepped forward from the group. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair peeking out from under a wool cap. Despite the cold, he moved with military bearing, and Sarah recognized the posture of a former service member. He approached her post respectfully, stopping at the appropriate distance that protocol required. "Guard," he said formally, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to military procedures. "I am Colonel Robert MacDonald, retired. These are members of my family, and we have come to pay our respects." He paused, his voice becoming more personal. "My son, Lieutenant David MacDonald, was killed in Afghanistan 3 months ago. He served with the Scots Guards, the same regiment that provides security here." Sarah felt her heart clench, but she maintained her expressionless facade. The colonel continued, his words heavy with grief, but spoken with military precision. "David always dreamed of serving at the royal residences. It was his greatest ambition to stand guard as you do now. He spoke of it often in his letters home." A younger woman stepped forward, tears streaming down her face despite the cold wind. "I'm David's wife, Emma," she said softly. "We were married just 2 years ago. He used to say that guarding the royal family was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. She held up a photograph of a young man in military dress uniform, his smile bright and proud. "This is our David." Sarah's training had prepared her for many situations, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. She could see the love and pride in Emma's eyes, mixed with the devastating grief of a young widow. The photograph showed a soldier who looked barely older than Sarah herself, full of life and ambition, cut short by the harsh realities of military service. The colonel placed a wreath at the base of the palace gates, his movements precise and ceremonial. Other family members followed, each placing flowers or small tokens of remembrance. A little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old approached with a small teddy bear wearing a miniature military uniform. "This is for the guard." "Man in heaven," the child said innocently, placing the bear next to the flowers. "Mummy says he's watching over the queen now from up there." She pointed toward the sky, her innocent faith providing a moment of comfort in the midst of such profound sorrow. The family gathered in a semicircle, and the colonel began to speak about his son. He told stories of David's childhood dreams of military service, his dedication during training, his courage in combat, and his love for his country and his family. Each word painted a picture of a young man who had embodied the very ideals that Sarah strove to represent in her own service. As the colonel spoke, Sarah found herself thinking about her own motivations for joining the Guard. She had been drawn by the history, the tradition, the chance to be part of something greater than herself. But listening to this family's tribute to their lost soldier, she realized there was something even more profound at stake. David MacDonald had given his life in service to the same crown she now protected, the same values she upheld. Emma stepped closer to Sarah's position, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would have been so honored to meet you," she said, "a woman breaking barriers in the Queen's Guard. David always believed that service should be based on merit and dedication, not gender. He would have respected you so much." The wind picked up, swirling the snow around the assembled group, but no one moved. This was their moment to honor David's memory, to connect with the institution he had died serving. Sarah could feel the weight of their grief, their pride, and their need to make this pilgrimage meaningful. A teenage boy who shared David's strong jawline stepped forward. "I'm David's younger brother, Michael," he said. "I'm joining the army next year. David always told me that if I was good enough, brave enough, and dedicated enough, maybe someday I could stand where you stand now." His voice cracked with emotion. "I want to make him proud." As the ceremony continued, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The cold seemed less bitter, her uniform felt less heavy, and her duty felt more meaningful than ever before. She was not just standing guard over a building or following ancient protocols. She was representing all the soldiers who had served before her, including Lieutenant David MacDonald, who would never have the chance to fulfill his dream of Royal Guard duty. The family began to prepare for departure, but the colonel approached Sarah one final time. With military precision, he rendered a perfect salute, holding it for several long seconds. It was a salute to the institution, to the tradition, and to Sarah herself as the living embodiment of the service his son had died protecting. In that moment, Sarah felt the full weight of her responsibility and the profound honor of her position. She was standing not just for herself, but for David MacDonald and all the soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. The spring morning at Windsor Castle was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the gentle sound of birds singing in the ancient oak trees. Guardsman Marcus Chen stood at his post near the castle's main entrance, his crisp red uniform, a stark contrast against the soft green of the awakening gardens. At 24, Marcus was the first member of his family to serve in the British military, a source of immense pride for his parents who had immigrated from Hong Kong 30 years earlier. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about duty, honor, and service from his grandfather, who had served in the Hong Kong police force during difficult times. These tales had inspired him to pursue a military career, and joining the Queen's Guard represented the pinnacle of that journey. Standing guard at Windsor Castle, one of the Queen's favorite residences, was both a privilege and a responsibility he took seriously. The morning shift was typically quiet, with groundskeepers tending to the immaculate gardens and the occasional delivery truck arriving at the service entrances. Marcus had learned to appreciate these peaceful moments, using them to reflect on his role and the history surrounding him. The castle walls had witnessed centuries of royal life, and he felt honored to be part of that continuing story. Around 10 o'clock, a small convoy of black vehicles approached the castle gates. This was not unusual, as various officials and dignitaries frequently visited Windsor. However, as the cars passed through security and moved toward the main building, Marcus noticed something different about this arrival. The usual protocol seemed more formal, more solemn than typical business visits. 20 minutes later, Marcus saw a group of people being escorted across the courtyard by palace staff. There were about 8 individuals, all impeccably dressed, walking with the measured pace of those attending an important ceremony. What caught his attention was the young woman in the center of the group, who appeared to be in her early 20s and was carrying a beautifully wrapped package. The group was led to a position near where Marcus stood guard. A palace official, whom Marcus recognized as one of the senior staff members, stepped forward and addressed the young woman formally. "Miss Jennifer Walsh, on behalf of Her Majesty, we welcome you and your family to Windsor Castle for this special recognition." Marcus remained motionless, but his attention was completely focused on the unfolding scene. The young woman, Jennifer, stepped forward with visible nervousness and excitement. She was petite, with auburn hair carefully styled for the occasion, and she wore a navy blue dress that was clearly chosen with great care for this important day. "Your Majesty," Jennifer said, and Marcus realized with a start that the Queen herself was approaching from the castle entrance. He had not been informed that the monarch would be present, which explained the increased security and formal protocol he had observed earlier. The Queen, dressed in a bright yellow coat and matching hat, moved with the grace and dignity that had characterized her long reign. Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious nervousness. "I am honored to present this to you on behalf of my great-grandmother, who passed away last month at the age of 102. She held up the wrapped package with trembling hands. "She served as a seamstress for the royal household for over 40 years, and she always spoke of her deep loyalty and affection for the royal family." The Queen accepted the package graciously, her experienced hands steady as she began to unwrap it carefully. Inside was an exquisite hand-embroidered cushion, its silk fabric gleaming in the morning sunlight. The needlework was incredibly detailed, featuring the royal coat of arms surrounded by delicate flowers and intricate patterns that must have taken months to complete. "My great-grandmother worked on this in secret for the last 3 years of her life," Jennifer explained, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Even when her eyesight was failing and her hands were shaking, she insisted on finishing it. She said it was her final gift to the royal family, her way of saying thank you for allowing her to serve for so many years. The Queen examined the cushion with obvious appreciation, running her fingers gently over the detailed embroidery. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary," she said warmly. "Please tell me about your great-grandmother. What was her name, and what did she do for the household?" Jennifer's composure began to crack as she spoke about her beloved great-grandmother. "Her name was Rose Walsh, Your Majesty. She started working for the royal household when she was just 16 years old. She helped maintain and repair the ceremonial clothing, the curtains, the tapestries. She used to tell me stories about the balls and state dinners, about the beautiful gowns she helped care for." The Queen nodded thoughtfully. "I remember Rose Walsh. She had such skillful hands and such attention to detail. She worked on some of my early state gowns, and her work was always flawless. She must have been very proud to see you today. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he watched this extraordinary exchange. Here was a young woman honoring her great-grandmother's decades of loyal service, presenting a final masterpiece created with failing eyesight and aging hands. The love and dedication that had gone into both the cushion and this moment were overwhelming. Jennifer's father stepped forward and spoke for the first time. "Your Majesty, Rose spoke about you often in her final years. She said serving the royal family had been the greatest privilege of her life. Even when she was in the nursing home, she would watch the royal events on television and point out details of the clothing and decorations to the other residents." The Queen smiled genuinely. "Service like your great-grandmother's is the foundation upon which the monarchy rests. Loyal, dedicated people who take pride in their work and contribute to something larger than themselves. This cushion will have a place of honor, and Rose's legacy will continue through it." As the Queen spoke these words, Marcus felt something profound stirring within him. He was witnessing the very essence of what his own service represented. Like Rose Walsh, he was part of a larger tapestry of dedication and loyalty. The elderly seamstress and the young guard were connected by the same commitment to duty and honor. Jennifer wiped away her tears and curtsied deeply. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Great-grandmother always said that being part of the royal household, even in a small way, made her feel part of history. I hope she would be proud of this moment." The Queen placed a gentle hand on Jennifer's arm. "I'm certain she would be extremely proud, not just of this beautiful gift, but of the granddaughter who traveled here to honor her memory. This is what true loyalty looks like, passed down through generations." As the ceremony concluded and the Queen returned to the castle, carrying Rose Walsh's final creation with obvious care, Marcus felt transformed by what he had witnessed. The young seamstress's great-granddaughter had demonstrated the same dedication to service that Marcus strived for every day. The thread connecting past and present, connecting all who served the crown, was unbroken and strong. Standing at his post as the visitors departed, Marcus understood more clearly than ever that his role was not just about following orders or maintaining tradition. He was part of a community of service that stretched back generations and would continue long after his own time was done. The summer evening at the Tower of London was warm and humid, with the ancient stone walls still radiating the heat they had absorbed throughout the long day. Guardsman William Patterson stood at his post near the famous White Tower, where the crown jewels were housed. At 28, William was a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been selected for Royal Guard duty based on his exemplary service record and unshakable composure under pressure. The Tower of London always felt different from the other royal residences where William had served. There was something heavier in the air here, weighted with centuries of history, both glorious and tragic. Kings and queens had lived within these walls, but so had prisoners facing execution. The ravens that were said to protect the kingdom strutted across the grounds with an almost supernatural presence, and William had learned to find their company oddly comforting during the long night shifts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fortress courtyard, the last tour groups of the day were making their way toward the exits. William had grown accustomed to the constant flow of visitors, their cameras and excited chatter as they learned about the tower's dramatic history. Most tourists were respectful of the guards, understanding that they were witnessing living history in action. Tonight, however, one visitor lingered after the others had gone. She was an elderly woman, probably in her 70s, with silver hair carefully arranged under a simple black hat. She moved slowly but with purpose, using a carved wooden walking stick that appeared to be quite old. What struck William most was her clothing. She wore a formal black dress with a small military medal pinned to her lapel, as if she were attending a memorial service. The woman approached William's position with obvious determination, though she maintained the respectful distance that protocol required. In the fading daylight, he could see that her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying. She stood silently for several minutes, simply looking up at the white tower where he was posted, her expression a mixture of grief and reverence. Finally, she spoke, her voice cultured but shaky with emotion. "Guard, I hope you will forgive an old woman for lingering past closing time. My name is Margaret Thornton, and I have come here on a very personal pilgrimage." She paused, steadying herself with her walking stick. 65 years ago today, my husband was executed within these walls." William felt his pulse quicken, though his expression remained impassive. The Tower of London had not seen an execution in decades, which meant this woman was speaking of something that had happened during World War II. He had studied the Tower's wartime history during his training, but hearing about it from someone who had lived through it was entirely different. Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. Captain Richard Thornton was a British intelligence officer who was captured while operating behind enemy lines in occupied France. He was brought here and charged with espionage. She looked directly at William, her eyes sharp despite her tears. "He was 26 years old, just 2 years younger than you appear to be now." The woman reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, faded photograph. Even from his position, William could see it showed a young man in military uniform, standing proudly with his arm around a beautiful young woman who was clearly Margaret in her youth. They both looked so happy, so full of life and hope for their future together. "We had been married for only 8 months when Richard was sent on his final mission," Margaret said, her voice becoming more intimate, as if she were sharing secrets with an old friend. "I was pregnant with our first child, though I didn't know it yet. I would spend the next 9 months carrying his son while grieving his death." William felt his chest tighten. Here was a woman who had lost everything. Her husband, her future, her dreams, all within the walls he now protected. The weight of that history, of the real human cost of the events that had unfolded here, suddenly felt overwhelming. Margaret stepped closer, still maintaining proper protocol distance, but near enough that William could see the deep lines that grief and time had etched into her face. "Richard wrote me one final letter before his execution. It was smuggled out by a guard who took pity on a young widow. In that letter, he told me that he was proud to die for his country, proud to have served the crown, and that he hoped someday our child would understand the sacrifice." She reached into her bag again and withdrew a worn piece of paper, yellowed with age and carefully preserved. "I have carried this letter with me for 65 years. Today, on the anniversary of his death, I wanted to read it here where he spent his final days. I wanted to honor his memory in the place where he showed such courage." With trembling hands, Margaret unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. Her voice carried across the empty courtyard, each word heavy with decades of love and loss. The letter spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of a young man's hope that his death would contribute to a better world for future generations. Richard Thornton had written about his love for his wife, his regret at not being able to see his unborn child, and his pride in serving alongside the brave guards who protected him even in his final hours. The guards treated him with dignity and respect, Margaret said, folding the letter carefully. Even though he was condemned to die, they recognized him as a fellow soldier who had served with honor. One of them, a young man not much older than Richard, stayed with him during his final night and helped him write this letter. William found himself imagining that scene, a young guard, probably feeling much as William did now, offering comfort to a condemned man who was little more than a boy himself. The parallel was not lost on him. He was standing in the same place, wearing the same uniform, representing the same values that had given Richard Thornton the strength to face death with courage. Margaret looked up at the tower's ancient windows, many of which were now dark as evening fell. I brought our son here once when he turned 18. David. We named him after Richard's father. I wanted him to understand what kind of man his father had been, what he had died for. David served in the Royal Navy for 30 years before retiring as a captain, just like his father. The woman's story was transforming William's understanding of his own duty. He had always known that the tower had been a place of imprisonment and execution, but hearing about it from someone who had lived through that history made it real in a way that no textbook ever could. Richard Thornton had been a real person, with hopes and dreams, not just a name in a historical record. "I come here every year on this date," Margaret said, her voice becoming softer as the shadows lengthened. "I'm 87 years old now, and I don't know how many more anniversaries I'll be able to observe. But I wanted to thank you, and all the guards who serve here, for maintaining the dignity of this place, for ensuring that the sacrifices made within these walls are never forgotten." As Margaret prepared to leave, she placed a single red rose at the base of the wall near William's post. "This is for Richard, and for all the brave souls who faced their fate here with courage. Thank you for standing guard over their memory." William watched as the elderly woman walked slowly away, her figure gradually disappearing into the gathering dusk. He felt profoundly changed by the encounter, understanding for the first time that his duty was not just about protecting buildings or following protocols. He was guarding the memory of heroes like Richard Thornton, ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten, that their courage would continue to inspire future generations. The autumn rain fell steadily on the grounds of Sandringham House, creating puddles that reflected the gray Norfolk sky. Guardsman Lisa Roberts stood under the covered walkway near the main entrance, grateful for the shelter as she maintained her vigilant watch. At 26, Lisa had served in Iraq before joining the Queen's Guard, and she brought a unique perspective to her duties that combined battlefield experience with ceremonial precision. Sandringham held special significance as the private country retreat of the royal family, particularly beloved by the Queen for its peaceful gardens and intimate atmosphere. Unlike the grand formality of Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, Sandringham felt more like a family home, albeit one that required the same level of security and protocol. Lisa appreciated the quieter pace here, which allowed her to truly focus on the subtle aspects of her protective duties. The morning had been unusually busy for a Tuesday in October. Several maintenance crews were working on the estate, preparing for the royal family's upcoming Christmas visit. Lisa had observed the groundskeepers with professional interest, noting their routines and ensuring that all personnel had been properly cleared and accounted for. Security was always a collaborative effort, and she took pride in her role as both guardian and observer. Around midday, a small group of visitors approached the main gates in a manner that immediately caught Lisa's attention. Unlike typical tourists, who usually arrived by bus or car, these 5 people had clearly walked a considerable distance. Their clothing was damp from the rain, and they carried themselves with the careful determination of people on an important mission. What struck Lisa most was their ages. They appeared to be in their 40s and 50s, too young to be casual sightseers on a weekday, too formally dressed to be hikers. The group was led by a woman with graying brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. She approached the security checkpoint with confidence, speaking quietly to the guard on duty. Lisa could not hear the conversation, but she observed the woman presenting some kind of documentation and gesturing toward her companions. After several minutes of discussion and phone calls, the group was escorted past the initial security barriers and toward the main house. Lisa maintained her position, but her attention was fully focused on these unusual visitors. As they drew closer, she could see that they all shared certain physical characteristics, similar facial structure, the same deep brown eyes, the way they carried themselves with quiet dignity. They were clearly related, probably siblings, and they moved with the coordinated purpose of a family united in a common goal. The estate manager, whom Lisa recognized from previous visits, approached the group with formal courtesy. "Welcome to Sandringham," he said warmly. "We have been expecting you. Her Majesty was very moved by your letter and wanted to meet with you personally." Lisa felt a surge of surprise. A personal meeting with the Queen was extremely rare, especially for visitors who were not dignitaries or officials. One of the men in the group stepped forward, removing his rain-dampened cap respectfully. "Thank you so much for arranging this," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Lisa could not immediately place. "We have traveled a very long way to be here today, and this opportunity means more to us than we can express. Our mother would have been overwhelmed with joy." The estate manager nodded understandingly. "Her Majesty specifically requested that this meeting take place in the morning room, which was one of your mother's favorite spaces when she worked here. She thought it would be appropriate for the circumstances." He gestured toward the house. "If you would please follow me, we can proceed inside." As the group prepared to enter Sandringham House, Lisa caught fragments of their conversation that provided context for this extraordinary visit. The woman who appeared to be the leader of the group spoke softly to her brothers. "Can you believe we're actually here? After all these years of Mother telling us stories about this place, we're finally going to see where she spent the happiest years of her life." Another sibling added, "I kept her letters from when she worked here. She wrote to Father every week, describing the gardens, the rooms, the daily routines. She said the royal family treated the staff like extended family, that she felt valued and respected in a way she had never experienced before." Lisa began to understand. These were the adult children of a former staff member who had worked at Sandringham, probably decades ago. Their pilgrimage here was a way of honoring their mother's memory and connection to the royal household. Such visits were rare but not unprecedented, especially when they involved long-serving staff members who had been particularly valued by the royal family. 20 minutes later, the group emerged from the house, and Lisa could see that they had all been deeply affected by their meeting. Several were openly weeping, and they moved with the careful, reverent pace of people who had just experienced something profound. The Queen herself appeared at the main entrance, a gesture of respect that Lisa had rarely observed during her service. The woman who had led the group approached the Queen one final time, carrying a small wooden box that she held with obvious care. "Your Majesty, our mother, Elena Kowalski, worked as a housekeeper here for 12 years in the 1970s and 1980s. When she passed away last month, we found this among her possessions." She opened the box to reveal a delicate porcelain figurine of a corgi, clearly a piece of royal memorabilia. "Elena never told us she had taken this," the woman continued, her voice thick with emotion. "She must have been too embarrassed, thinking we would disapprove. But we found a note she had written, explaining that it had been given to her as a Christmas gift by your mother, the Queen Mother, in 1983. She treasured it for 40 years but felt she should return it to its proper home." The Queen examined the figurine with obvious recognition and warmth. "I remember Elena very well," she said softly. "She was absolutely devoted to Sandringham. She knew every corner of this house, every preference of every family member. And yes, I remember my mother giving her this figurine. Elena had mentioned how much she loved the corgis, and my mother thought she should have something to remember them by." One of the men stepped forward, his voice barely controlled. "Your Majesty, Elena spoke of you and your family every day for the rest of her life. Even when she developed dementia in her final years, she could still remember stories about working here. She would tell the nurses about arranging flowers, about preparing rooms for royal visits, about feeling like she was part of something important and meaningful." The Queen's expression softened further. "Elena was part of something important. Staff members like your mother are the foundation that allows places like Sandringham to function as both a family home and a working royal residence. Her dedication and care made it possible for my family to find peace and happiness here. As the meeting concluded, the Queen did something that surprised even Lisa, experienced as she was with royal protocol. She insisted on personally walking the family to the main gates, pointing out features of the gardens and buildings that their mother had helped maintain. "Elena would have wanted you to see how well her work has endured," the Queen explained. "The flower beds she planted are still blooming. The routines she established are still followed." Standing at her post, Lisa watched this extraordinary display of personal attention and respect. The Queen was not just... The Christmas morning at Buckingham Palace was crisp and clear, with frost sparkling on the courtyard stones like scattered diamonds. Guardsman Daniel Murphy stood at his ceremonial post, his breath forming small clouds in the cold December air. At 31, Daniel was the most senior of the guards on duty that morning, and he took special pride in maintaining the highest standards during the Christmas season when the royal family gathered for their traditional celebrations. Daniel had been serving with the Queen's Guard for 8 years, longer than any of his current colleagues. He had witnessed countless ceremonies, state visits, and royal occasions, but Christmas duty held particular significance for him. There was something magical about protecting the royal family during their most personal and intimate celebrations, knowing that inside the palace they were experiencing the same joys and traditions that families across the kingdom shared on this special day. The morning had begun quietly, with only the essential staff moving through the palace corridors as the royal family prepared for their traditional Christmas activities. Daniel's position gave him a view of the main courtyard, where delivery trucks had arrived earlier with last-minute gifts and supplies for the royal Christmas celebrations. Everything had to be perfect, and Daniel felt the weight of that responsibility as he maintained his vigilant watch. Around 10 o'clock, something unusual began to happen. Small groups of people started gathering outside the palace gates, but these were not the typical Christmas tourists hoping for a glimpse of the royal family. These visitors were different. Many were elderly, some were in wheelchairs, others leaned heavily on walking sticks or were supported by younger family members. They carried flowers, small gifts, and handwritten cards, and they moved with the careful determination of people on a deeply personal mission. A palace official emerged from the main entrance and approached Daniel's position. "Guardsman Murphy," the official said formally, "we have received special permission from Her Majesty for an unusual Christmas ceremony today. These visitors are all family members of former royal household staff who have passed away in recent years. They have been invited to participate in a memorial service to honor their loved one's service to the crown." Daniel felt his pulse quicken, with interest and emotion. In all his years of service, he had never witnessed anything like this. The idea that the royal family would organize a special Christmas ceremony to honor deceased staff members demonstrated a level of personal attention and care that went far beyond normal protocol. The palace gates opened, and the groups of visitors were carefully escorted into the main courtyard. Daniel counted approximately 40 people, ranging in age from small children to elderly adults who appeared to be in their 80s or 90s. Many were clearly struggling with grief, but their faces also showed pride and anticipation as they were guided to positions near the main entrance of the palace. A temporary podium had been set up in the courtyard, decorated with evergreen wreaths and red ribbon in keeping with the Christmas theme. Palace staff distributed programs that Daniel could see contained names and photographs, clearly a memorial listing of the staff members being honored. The visitors clutched these programs carefully, many wiping away tears as they read the tributes to their loved ones. Then, in a moment that took Daniel's breath away, the Queen herself appeared at the main entrance of the palace. She was dressed in a deep purple coat with a matching hat, and she moved with the grace and dignity that had characterized her long reign. But what struck Daniel most was the expression on her face. This was not the formal ceremonial demeanor she displayed during state occasions. This was personal, intimate, filled with genuine warmth and affection. "My dear friends," the Queen began, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite the cold morning air. "On this Christmas morning, we gather not to mourn but to celebrate the extraordinary lives of service that connected us all as one extended family. The men and women we honor today were not just employees of the royal household. They were valued, members of our community who made our work possible and our lives richer." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to the Queen's words. This was not a formal speech written by palace officials. These were personal reflections from someone who had clearly known and cared about the people being honored. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, and it transformed the cold December morning into something warm and sacred. The Queen continued, sharing specific memories of several staff members who had served for decades. She spoke of Arthur Williams, a groundskeeper who had maintained the palace gardens for 35 years and who had personally taught 3 generations of royal children about flowers and trees. She remembered Maria Santos, a housekeeper whose attention to detail and caring nature had made every royal residence feel like a true home. She honored James Fletcher, a driver who had safely transported the royal family for 22 years and who had become a trusted confidant and friend. As the Queen spoke, family members stepped forward to place wreaths and flowers at the base of the palace steps. A young girl, probably no more than 8 years old, approached with a small bouquet of daisies. She was clearly the great-granddaughter of one of the honored staff members, and she moved with the careful reverence of a child who understood she was participating in something important. "These flowers are for my great-granny Rose," the little girl said in a clear, sweet voice that carried across the silent courtyard. "She used to clean the pretty rooms in the palace, and she always told me that the Queen was the nicest lady in the whole world." The Queen knelt down to accept the flowers personally, and Daniel saw her whisper something to the child that made the little girl smile with pure joy. One by one, family members were invited to share brief memories of their loved ones. An elderly man spoke about his father, who had served as a palace chef for 27 years and who had taken immense pride in preparing meals for royal celebrations. A middle-aged woman remembered her mother, who had worked as a seamstress and who had helped maintain the ceremonial uniforms that guards like Daniel wore with such pride. Each story revealed the deep personal connections that had existed between the royal family and their staff. These were not distant, formal employment relationships. They were genuine friendships built over years of shared experiences, mutual respect, and common dedication to maintaining the traditions and dignity of the monarchy. As the ceremony continued, Daniel realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. The Queen was using Christmas morning, the most important day of the Christian calendar and a time traditionally reserved for family, to honor people who had served the crown with dedication and love. She was demonstrating that the royal household was indeed an extended family, one that remembered and celebrated every member. The service concluded with the singing of Silent Night, and Daniel found himself moved beyond words as the voices of the grieving families joined with palace staff and even some members of the royal family who had come outside to participate. The song echoed off the ancient palace walls, creating a moment of perfect unity between past and present, between those who served and those who were served. As the visitors prepared to depart, the Queen made a point of speaking personally with each family. Daniel watched as she embraced elderly widows, shook hands with proud sons and daughters, and listened carefully to stories about the loved ones being honored. It was clear that she knew many of these people personally, that their grief was her grief, their pride was her pride. Standing at his post as the ceremony ended and the families slowly made their way back through the palace gates, Daniel felt fundamentally changed by what he had witnessed. He understood now that his service was not just about following protocol or maintaining security. He was part of a community of dedication that stretched back generations and would continue long after his own service ended. The Christmas morning memorial had shown him that every person who served the crown with honor and dignity would be remembered, that their contributions would be valued not just during their working years, but for all time. As he stood guard on that sacred Christmas morning, Daniel felt proud to be part of that tradition, grateful to serve an institution that recognized the humanity and worth of every person who contributed to its mission.